In the first video in this series, I showed proof of a flattening U.S. democracy around 1980 and a decline in our democracy starting around 2012. I showed that trust in government started to shift from very trusting in the early 1960s to very little trust by 1980, and that continues to this day. I showed that the shift to income inequality being the norm started around 1980. In this video, I'm going to get into what the potential causes of this decline are. Not everything on this list is a direct contributor, and some things have a bigger effect than others, but like with most things in life, the true causes of something this complex do not have simple explanations. The causes themselves are often every bit as complicated as the problem itself, but I will do my best to show a neutral view of what the causes could be based on my research. I'm going to go way back to the FDR era and talk about how the size of the federal government exploded during his tenure with the New Deal reforms and regulations from 1933 to 1939. Social Security was part of this as well in 1935. These reforms are mostly looked at as good and to this day well liked. They also created an environment that massively increased the size of the federal government, which just encourages money in politics to become a factor in the future. Next, we need to talk about workers' rights. Now, I'm not here to say unions are perfect, that they have not been rife with corruption historically. There have been a ton of unions that were incredibly corrupt, most notably the Teamsters Union and Jimmy Hoffa with the direct ties to the mob. But at the core of what a union is, they are simply just giving some power to the working class. Clearly, a balance needs to be present. Unions or corporations having too much of the power is not healthy. Correlation is not causation, but there is a clear correlation between union density and income share for the bottom 90% of Americans. The destruction of unions had two major turning points. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was signed into law. This law was a response to some of the corruption that had been taking place in unions, but in many ways, it may have went too far. And to this day, it remains in effect. The most glaring example of the Taft-Hartley Act going too far was the right-to-work provision, which allowed a state to enact right-to-work laws, which forced a union to represent both paying and non-paying members. This caused many employees to not join unions, and this in essence killed most unions in these states as they were no longer funded. So it is clear that Taft-Hartley was the beginning of the end for unions, but what about the sharp decline around the 1980s time period? Well, that is at least partially attributable to Ronald Reagan and his handling of the walkout by the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO, which was an illegal strike under Taft-Hartley, in which 13,000 air traffic controllers walked off their jobs. He ordered them back to work within 48 hours, and with most in return, he ended up firing about 11,000 workers. It ended up taking the FAA almost 10 years to return staffing to normal levels. But Reagan won this battle and set a new precedent that many businesses would use in the future to take similar action. This in essence crushed unions, and they are currently in a nearly powerless situation in many states. It is hard to not view this as having a large effect on the growth on income inequality in this country. The sad reality of all this union busting is that most Americans still view unions in a positive light. What about the distrust in government that seemed to wane starting in the late 1960s? There are many factors, but probably the biggest is the start of the Cold War and the beginning of very unpopular wars. Vietnam, Korea, and many smaller skirmishes. These were all very unpopular and certainly added to this distrust in government. A more controversial take on the decline in government trust would be the many conspiracy theories surrounding controversial deaths of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and others during this time period. These all add to the distrust in my opinion. I say in my opinion because we likely never will know the full truth in regard to these deaths. I want to say that I am one that in most cases does not believe conspiracy theories. And in these deaths, I think in most cases the official explanation is the most likely explanation. But the way these deaths were handled by the federal government and the lack of transparency just leaves open a lot of questions. And just focusing on JFK for a moment, the poor security given to a sitting president, the very poor security for his accused killer, all leave open the door for a ton of speculation to occur. Also, the fact that at the time of JFK's death, the country was in absolute frenzy of the spread of communism, and with many in the federal government not happy with Kennedy not being as aggressive as they wanted, the idea that the CIA CIA or some other organization would assassinate him is within the realm of possibility in my view. Again, I think the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy as a lone wolf is probably the most likely solution, but given all the evidence, I think there's probably a 10 to 20% chance that it is a deeper conspiracy. 10 to 20% is too high for something as important as the assassination of what is one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. So I have to put this as a factor in the public distrust of government starting in the late 1960s. Another factor has to be Nixon and Watergate. There's a strong decline in the 1970s under Nixon, and it's hard to not attribute that to that scandal. Few things will cause the public distrust of government than a scandal of that magnitude. These are all likely factors in the decline of distrust from the late 1960s forward, but what are some factors of the continued distrust today? Well, certainly the continued bad wars with Iraq and staying in Afghanistan for way too long, and a poorly executed exit from Afghanistan as well recently. The beginning of the surveillance state that began with the passing of the Patriot Act and potentially infringing on the rights of lawful Americans. I'm not a believer in the theory that the general election is rigged, but I do believe that the Democratic primary has been rigged the last two presidential cycles. Not by direct ballot stuffing or any of that nonsense, but you can't tell me that most of the center-left candidates in the 2020 primary, most notably Buttigieg and Klobuchar, dropping out the day before Super Tuesday to endorse Biden is a coincidence. It's hard not to look at that as suspect, considering both had a legitimate shot at the nomination. Now, I'm not saying what they did is illegal. In fact, it is perfectly legal. Is it moral or just? I don't believe so, and I think that adds to the distrust of not just the government, but of the two establishment parties. Now, as for the actual ballot process and actual true election fraud, I don't believe we have a problem with that. I encourage you to do the research on that yourself, but suffice it to say, for there to be a conspiracy that deep, you would need a lot of judges to be on board with it. But unfortunately, many do, and much of that belief comes from Donald Trump and his constant assertion that the 2020 election was rigged or stolen from him. To believe this, you would need to believe that 63 different cases had judges that are in on the conspiracy. A general rule of thumb in conspiracy theory is the more independent people and jurisdictions you would have to get involved to execute a conspiracy, the more likely that conspiracy is not real. If this conspiracy is real, it would have to be by far the most complex one in history to pull off. It's not real. This dangerous rhetoric from Trump led to the January 6th insurrection and furthered the growing divide. Many have a distrust of government because of real issues. Now we can add a whole new pile of people that distrust the government because of claims that are completely and utterly baseless. What other factors have led to an increasing distrust? Well, the U.S. was given a huge leg up on the rest of the world after World War II. Europe was in shambles, and after the war, the U.S. was by far the largest economy and the only superpower. We have mostly squandered that over the years, and now we're soon to see China take over as the world's leading economy. In the 70s, the U.S. saw terribly high inflation, which led to the highest readings ever on the misery index. While other factors caused a decrease in Americans' trust in government, money in politics is clearly a major factor. There are many ways one can look at this, but in order to be objective, I must present to you the most fair chart of the history of presidential spending. This chart normalizes for not only inflation, but also population growth. This is probably the fairest representation, and even with heavy normalization, we can see explosive growth in money in politics, especially for the highest office starting around 2000. For House and Senate, when you apply the adjustments, it is not as extreme, but still increasing. It is clear this is a factor in the people's distrust of their government, and it is even affecting the amount of time a congressman spends actually doing their job. The Citizens United ruling was a major blow towards hope of getting money out of politics as well. Gerrymandering is another factor. Gerrymandering is simply the redrawing of districts to give one party an advantage. The explosion of gerrymandering started around the year 2000 with Republican strategist Tom Hofeller. He is the mastermind behind many very successful redistrictings, most notably in North Carolina. This quote from Hofeller's speech in 2000 sums up his views on the subject. Redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event. Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters. One thing that always bothers me about political discourse is when people try to blame both sides equally, a false equivalency, if you will. I will not be doing that. Instead, when a party is more to blame, I will always call that out. In this case, while Democrats do also gerrymander, Republicans have been much more aggressive and egregious at doing it. A comprehensive statistical analysis done by the Associated Press in 2017 found 4 times as many districts were skewed towards Republicans versus Democrats. That is more a Republican problem than a Democrat problem. That is not to say Democrats are great or that I favor them. I've already called them out for essentially rigging the Democratic primary for Biden, and they also did similar things to rig it for Hillary Clinton. They're extremely corrupt as well, and they're bought and paid for by the corporations and money in politics just as much, if not more, than Republicans. These are all causes of the public's trust in government declining. Some of these things have also been factors in things like income inequality and societal polarization. But let's get into some more potential causes of these factors, starting with income inequality. A likely very large factor causing income inequality is the death of unions, which we have already covered. The next likely cause of the increase in income inequality starting around the time of Reagan's inauguration is Reaganomics, and later the continuation and furthering of Reaganomics under Bill Clinton. Reaganomics, or trickle-down economics, is the belief that if you reduce taxes and regulations on corporations, that will boost the economy as a whole and cause the growing wealth of the corporations to trickle down to the working class. Well, it is clear to see in every single income inequality chart I have shown that this is 100% not the case. Now, the economy as a whole did improve greatly under Reagan, and that is probably at least partially why many people bought into this idea so aggressively, and many to this day still buy in. The thing about economic cycles is they're very much longer than 4 to 8 years, and things that happened 10 years prior can still have a large effect on the current economy. So saying the economy improved because of Reaganomics is a stretch. The reality is trickle-down is probably good for the economy as a whole, as it encourages large corporations to do business in your country. The problem is the economic growth is not shared equally, and most did not see any benefit from it at all. The other thing about Reaganomics is that we have never gotten away from it since then. Reagan is viewed as a hero by the Republican Party still to this day. The irony is Bill Clinton for a long time was viewed very positively by many Democrats, though that has changed in the last 10 years. Why is this so ironic is because Bill Clinton was very far from being a progressive ideologue. In fact, he drastically increased the scale and scope of Reaganomics. A great example of this is him drastically reducing the size of welfare with the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. The number of welfare recipients declined much more sharply than the poverty rate post this legislation. This was largely good for the wealthy and not good for the poor, as is the theme post-Reagan. Presidents post-Clinton did little to move away from trickle-down, including the most liberal president quite possibly since FDR and Obama. Obama, it turns out, while more liberal than Clinton, was still very much a centrist like Clinton. That, combined with some of the most extreme partisanship in history, led to very little in terms of change. So much for that campaign slogan. Again, the reality is 61% of Americans say that income inequality is a problem. When the majority of public wants something, but the majority of elected representatives wants another thing, that is how you have a democracy in decline. On top of that, consider the fact that we have seen multiple bailouts of major corporations over the years, most notably in 2008. The statement, socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, is based on many real-world truths. Now let's get into societal polarization and deep dysfunctioning of government. Again, some of the causes listed above have affected the polarization we see. We will get into some details and causes to further these points. First, let's quantify the dysfunctioning of the government. We all know it to be dysfunctional, but let's see some proof. This is the number of bills passed by the government. You can see the sharp decline. Next, let's see some quantifiable evidence of the polarization in the U.S. House. This polarization is largely reflected in how the public votes. What are the causes and origins of this polarization? Who is the most to blame? I lay the most blame on the media, and the origin of this I lay on ABC and their covering of the Democratic Convention in 1968. They were behind in the ratings and decided to shake it up by having a debate between two bitter rivals on opposite ends of the political spectrum, Buckley and Vidal. It became heated, but the public ate it up, and it catapulted ABC up the ratings. This set a new trend, and many media outlets copied this format of having heated and caustic debates frequently on their broadcasts. Eventually, when talk radio and 24-hour cable news became a thing, this kind of rhetoric became a constant in our lives. That concludes the causes segment of this series. In the next video, we will get into some potential solutions. I know some of these issues seem insurmountable, but I like to be an optimist whenever possible. These problems can be fixed. I will see you in the next video. Please comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you.